The needle was 3 inches from the vein when the dying dog lifted his paws and wrapped them around his handler's shoulders. Atlas, 6 years old, a German shepherd, who had cleared buildings under fire and never once flinched, was holding on. Mason Reyes felt the tremor in those legs and broke completely. Then the veterinarian stopped. Her hand froze. Her face emptied. Something on the monitor was moving in a way that no dying animal's numbers should ever move, and she realized that everything she had been told about this dog was a lie. Before we begin, subscribe and stay with this story until the very end, and leave a comment telling us what city you are watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The call came at 4:47 in the morning, and Mason Reyes was already awake because he was always awake at that hour. 8 years in the teams had stripped out whatever part of him used to sleep through darkness. He sat on the edge of the bed with his boots already laced, and he stared at the screen of his phone, and he knew before he picked it up that the world was about to fold in half. The clinic never called at that hour. The clinic called at 9 with test results, with routine updates, with the flat bureaucratic language of an institution that had 1,000 animals in one form for each of them. Dr. Nadia Serrano did not waste time on greeting. She told him to come now. She told him it was Atlas. She told him the dog had collapsed in the kennel sometime after 2, that they had him stabilized, that his organ function was falling faster than anything she could account for. And then she stopped talking, and it was the stopping that took the air out of Mason's chest. He had heard that pause before in the mouths of medics standing over men he loved. That pause was not information. That pause was mercy, the small silence a person leaves so the other person can get their hands under the weight before it lands. He did not remember the truck. He did not remember the gate or the guard who waved him through when he saw the look on his face, or the 2 red lights he ran on the base road with the windows down and the ocean air coming off the strand like something cold and indifferent. What he remembered was the thought that ran through him on a loop the entire way. The same 4 words over and over, the way a man repeats a prayer he does not believe in, because there is nothing else left in his mouth. Hold on. Just hold on. Atlas was not equipment. Atlas was the reason Mason Reyes had a heartbeat to drive with. 6 years old, tan and black, a saddleback coat that went gold in the sun and iron in shadow, and a tactical harness with his call sign stitched into the side by a woman in Virginia who had done the same for 40 other dogs, most of whom had come home and some of whom had not. Atlas had more confirmed detections than any dog in the unit's history. He had found buried charges that would have taken an entire element off the board. He had gone into a collapsed structure in a coastal village and stayed in it for 9 hours until a translator's daughter came out breathing. And 14 months ago, he had put his jaws in the drag handle of Mason's plate carrier and hauled him 30 feet across open ground with rounds cutting the air above them both. That was the ledger. That was the whole arithmetic of Mason's life, and it did not balance and it never would. Pike and Whitlock were in the quarter when he came through the doors. They had not been called. Nobody had called them. They were simply there the way men in that unit were always simply there, because a phone had gone off in one house and then in another, and nobody had asked why. Whitlock had his arms crossed hard against his own ribs, and his jaw was working like he was chewing something that would not go down. Pike could not look up from the floor. Neither of them said anything, and neither of them had to, because Mason had spent a decade reading men in exactly this state, and what he read in that corridor made his legs feel like they belonged to a stranger. Serrano met him outside the exam room. She was steady. She had been steady for 20 years, and she had delivered this kind of news enough times that her voice had learned to do it without cracking. And that was precisely what frightened him, because underneath the steadiness, her eyes were soft in a way he had never once seen from her. She told him the numbers. Kidney values off the scale, liver enzymes climbing, oxygen saturation dropping despite support. She told him they had tried 3 interventions overnight, and the dog's body had not responded to any of them. She told him this was not the slow decline of an aging animal, that it had come on in hours, that it had the shape of something rather than the shape of nothing, and that she could not find the something. Then she told him that command had authorized euthanasia and that the paperwork was already in the file. Mason heard the word the way a man hears an incoming round he has already been hit by. There is a delay. There is a moment where the body has not yet agreed to what the ears have accepted. He asked her to say it again. She said it again. He told her no. He did not shout it. He said it the way he had said things over a radio in bad places, flat and low and absolutely final. And Serrano did not argue with him because she had already made a decision about this morning that she had not yet said out loud. He asked to see the authorization. That was the first thing that did not fit, and afterward, months later, Mason would come back to it over and over because it was the loose thread in a thing that was supposed to be seamless. Serrano hesitated. She was not a woman who hesitated. Then she pulled up the file and she turned the screen so he could read it, and she watched his face while he did. The timestamp on the signature was 14 hours old. 14 hours. Atlas had collapsed sometime after 2 in the morning. The document authorizing the ending of his life had been executed the previous afternoon while the dog was upright while he was eating, while a kennel tech had walked him 120 yards and logged the walk as normal. Mason read it 3 times to be certain that he was not misreading a date field in the state he was in, and each time the numbers stayed where they were. He asked Serrano who had filed it. She said it had come through Captain Marsh's office with a command endorsement attached. He asked her what the justification was, and she scrolled, and the justification was 2 lines long, and the 2 lines took the floor out from under him. Behavioral degradation, elevated aggression indicators, recommendation for medical separation with humane disposition. Mason Reyes had handled that dog for 6 years. He had put his hands in that dog's mouth to pull out a chicken bone somebody had thrown over a fence. He had let that dog sleep on his chest through nights when the ceiling would not stay still. Atlas had growled at a friendly exactly 1 time in his entire service life at Whitlock in a collapsed building because a child was still under the concrete, and Whitlock had tried to pull him off, and Whitlock had told that story at 3 separate barbecues, since with tears in his eyes. There were no aggression indicators. There had never been aggression indicators. And underneath the 2 lines was a field veterinary clearance with a signature block, and the signature belonged to a corpsman. Mason knew by name, and Mason knew that corpsman's name because the man had been flown out of theater on a medevac with a fractured pelvis the day before the exam had supposedly taken place. He said that out loud. He said it quietly. And Nadia Serrano, who had been running on protocol in grief for 6 straight hours, went the color of the wall behind her. She told him she needed a minute. She did not take a minute. She stood there and she looked at the screen, and Mason watched a professional woman rearrange her entire understanding of a morning in real time. Then she told him something she absolutely was not supposed to tell him, which was that when the order had come down, she had questioned it because the timing had felt wrong to her, even before she knew why, and that she had been told the endorsement was command level and not hers to interpret. Then she opened the door and let him into the room. What was on that table did not look like Atlas. That was the thing Mason could not get past in the first seconds. The body was the right size and the coat was the right color, but everything that made the animal himself had been drained out and replaced with a shallow, rattling effort. His breathing came in pulls that sounded expensive, like each one was being paid for out of a fund that was nearly empty. His eyes were clouded. His muzzle was slack. He had been given something for pain, and it had taken the sharpness out of him and left behind an old dog, a stranger's dog, a dog with nothing left to give. And then Atlas saw him, and the fog moved. It was not much. It was a flicker behind the eyes, the smallest correction, the way a compass needle settles when it finds north. But Mason had built his entire adult life on being able to read that face, and he saw it, and he went down onto his knees beside the table so fast that his kneecaps hit the floor, and he did not feel it. He got his hands around the dog's head. He held it the way he had held it after every mission, after every bad night, after the divorce, after the funerals. He told him he was there. He told him he was not going anywhere. Atlas tried to lift his head and could not. The muscles in his neck stood out with the effort, and the whole thing bought him half an inch before it collapsed back down. Then the paw came across the table and pressed against Mason's wrist. It was the oldest thing between them. 6 years, 4 countries, 1 improvised training kennel in a storm, where a wild and untrusting 2-year-old had refused to look at anybody for 11 days, and then on the 12th night had put a paw on the wrist of a young sailor who had been sitting outside his run, talking about nothing at all. The paw meant one thing, and it had only ever meant one thing: I am here. You are mine. Nothing about this changes. Behind them, Whitlock stepped into the doorway and stepped back out again. Pike did not come in at all. Serrano moved to the counter with the tray, and the sound of the instrument settling on metal went through that room like something structural giving way. She asked him if he wanted more time. He could not answer her. He put both arms around his dog's chest and he put his face into the fur at the base of the neck, and he tried to say the things a person says and they came out in pieces. That he had done his duty. That he had been brave every single day of a life that nobody had asked him to volunteer for. That he was the best of them, all of them, every man in that unit, and every one of them knew it. He did not get to the end of it. He could not. And that was when Atlas moved. It was not a twitch. It was not the reflex of a nervous system winding down. The dog gathered something out of a body that had no business containing anything, and he lifted both front paws off the table, and he put them over Mason Reyes's shoulders, and he pressed his head into the curve of the man's neck, and he held on. Whitlock made a sound in the doorway like he had been hit in the stomach. Pike sat down on the floor of the corridor with his back against the wall and his hand over his mouth. Serrano lowered her head and closed her eyes and stood very still. And in 20 years of practice, she had held the hands of handlers who could not hold themselves, and she had never seen a dog do what this dog was doing. The paws were shaking against his back. The whole body was shaking. And then Mason felt something hot slide down the side of his neck and soak into the collar of his uniform, and he thought at first that it was his own, and it was not. The dog was crying, actual tears running out of clouded eyes and down into tan and black fur, and onto camouflage fabric, and each one landed with the weight of a word that Atlas had never had the equipment to say. Mason Reyes came apart on the floor of that room. Everything 8 years had built in him, the flat voice, the locked jaw, the ability to watch terrible things happen and keep moving through them. All of it went at once. He held on tighter because letting go felt like dying, and he begged out loud to a God he had stopped speaking to in a valley 6,000 miles away for one more minute. Just one more. Serrano lifted the syringe, and then she stopped. Not slowly, not out of pity, and not to give him room. She stopped the way a person stops when every alarm their training ever installed goes off at the same instant. Her head came up, and her eyes went past him to the monitor and stayed there. The numbers were wrong. They were not fading. That was the entire problem, and it hit her all at once and took her breath. A body shutting down does not do what those numbers were doing. It goes quiet, it slopes, it surrenders. What she was looking at was spiking, erratic, surging in patterns that had nothing whatsoever to do with organ failure, and his heart rate was climbing and his body was jerking in short, involuntary catches that she had seen 1,000 times in 1,000 animals and never once in a dying one. That was not a system going out. That was a system in pain. She put the syringe down. She told Mason to hold him steady, and she did not explain why. Her hands went to the dog's rib cage and moved down the left side, pressing feeling, and on the 6th rib, Atlas screamed. It was not a whimper. It was a sound that emptied the room of air, sharp and sudden and enormous, and Mason flinched hard enough to bang his elbow on the table leg. Whitlock spun around in the doorway. Pike came up off the corridor floor in one motion. Serrano jerked her hands back and stared at them like they belonged to somebody else. She said it twice before anyone understood her, because the first time her voice would not carry. That was not organ failure. That was focal trauma. And the sorrow was gone out of her entirely by the second time, burned off and replaced by something hard and fast and clinical. Because there is a specific quality of horror that only comes to a professional who realizes she has been about to do the exact opposite of her job. Mason asked her what she meant. He asked it from the floor, with his dog still hanging off his shoulders and his own hands buried in the fur. She told him that Atlas was not failing because his organs were diseased. I was failing because something inside him was pressing on them. Something that had no business being in there at all. Something that had been in there long enough for his body to build a wall around it and keep working anyway, day after day. Walk after walk, night after night on the floor beside a bed, while a man who would have died for him slept 4 feet away and never knew. She reached over and killed the tray. She said she needed imaging, and she needed it immediately because if she was right about what she was feeling under those ribs, then a piece of paper signed 14 hours before this dog ever collapsed had come within 3 inches of ending the life of an animal who was not dying at all. He was wounded, and he had been hiding it. The portable unit came through the door 90 seconds later, pushed by a tech who had been told to move and had not been told why, and Nadia Serrano started giving instructions before the machine was even plugged in. left side, 6th through 8th. Do not let anything shift. Mason got his hands under the dog and rolled him. It took 4 seconds and it cost him something he would not have words for later, because Atlas whimpered the entire way through it and never once resisted, never pulled, never turned his head to protect himself. He just kept his eyes on Mason's face the whole time, the way he had done in the back of helicopters and the beds of trucks and the floors of buildings that were coming apart. And that was the thing Mason could not stand. Total trust from an animal who had every reason on earth to have stopped trusting somebody 9 days ago. The first exposure fired. Atlas flinched at the pressure, not the light. Serrano called for a lower angle. The second fired. The tech carried the plates out and Mason stayed on the floor with his hand flat on the dog's shoulder, and Whitlock came in and stood behind him and put a hand on the back of his neck without saying anything, which was the correct thing to do and the only correct thing available. Pike said from the doorway that if somebody had signed that paper 14 hours early, somebody was going to answer for it, and Serrano told him to shut up, not unkindly, because she needed her head and she was losing it. The image came up on the monitor and the room stopped functioning. It sat there between the pale architecture of the ribs, dark and angular, and absolutely unmistakable, a hard shard of something that had never grown in a living body and had no business inside one. It did not look like a shadow. It did not look like an artifact of the machine. It looked like exactly what it was, and every person in that room understood it in the same half second, and nobody said a word for 4 or 5 seconds afterward. Whitlock breathed out a question that was mostly profanity. Serrano zoomed in and her jaw set. She had it measured before she spoke. Metallic, jagged, lodged deep between the 6th and 7th and roughly 4 millimeters off the left pulmonary artery. 4 millimeters. She said the number twice, and the second time she said it, the professional composure she had rebuilt after putting down that syringe cracked again, but it did not crack into grief. It cracked into fury, and it was the first time Mason had ever heard the woman sound like she wanted to break something. A voice from the door said it was not debris. Dr. Malcolm Frey had been on base 6 days on a rotation. Nobody had asked him about a trauma surgeon with 30 years of pulling foreign objects out of bodies that were not supposed to contain them. And he had heard the noise from the corridor and followed it the way men of his generation follow noise. He crossed the room, leaned into the screen, and looked at it for 11 seconds without blinking. Then he said it was a projectile fragment, roughly 7.62, high velocity on entry, enough to punch through intercostal tissue, and not enough to exit. And it had been sitting in there shifting with every breath the dog took. Mason heard himself ask how long and did not recognize his own voice. Frey told Serrano to pull the tissue detail. She pulled it. He studied it and his face changed in a way that had nothing clinical left in it at all. And he told Mason that there was scar tissue around the wound channel layered, organized the kind that only forms over days. Not hours, not overnight. He put a floor on it at 9 days and said the real number was probably higher, 9 days. Mason sat back on his heels and the arithmetic started running whether he wanted it to or not. 9 days meant 2 training cycles. 9 days meant 3 kennel checks by 3 different people with 3 sets of hands. 9 days meant a 120-yard walk logged as normal by a tech who had noticed nothing, and it meant 9 nights of a twig lying on the floor beside his bed with a piece of metal grinding against an artery every single time he inhaled and never once making a sound about it. He said out loud that Atlas had slept on his feet on Tuesday. That was all he could get out. Whitlock turned around and faced the wall. The memory came up on him fast and unwelcome the way they always did. The compound on the coast, the hostage recovery that had gone from quiet to catastrophic in about 4 seconds, the whole structure lighting up from 3 positions at once. And Atlas out front doing what Atlas did, and Mason behind him doing what Mason did. And in the middle of all that noise, there had been a crack that did not match. Closer than the incoming, sharper, wrong in a way he had registered and then discarded because the human brain does not have time to catalog everything during a firefight, and his brain had made a call. Atlas had stumbled, half a step, a hitch so small that if Mason had blinked, he would have missed it, and then the dog had shaken himself once and kept moving, cleared 2 more corridors and come out the other side, wagging. Mason had run his hands over him afterward. He said that to Frey now, and there was something close to pleading in it, because he needed the man to understand that he had checked. He had checked the whole animal nose to tail the way he had checked him after every engagement for 6 years. There was no blood, no entry, no heat, no swelling, no flinch. The dog had licked his face and leaned into his legs and behaved exactly like a dog behaves when the bad part is over and his person is still standing. Frey said that was the entire problem with fragment wounds through heavy coat and dense muscle. No obvious entry mark, minimal external bleeding because the fur mat's over it. It would have felt to the animal like a hard impact and nothing more for the first hour, and after that, adrenaline and training would have carried him straight through the window where he might have shown something. Then Frey said the part that took the last of the air out of the room. He said that after that window closed, the dog would have felt it. Every day, constantly, and that a working dog of that caliber does not stop working because of pain. He suppresses it because the pain is his problem and the mission is everybody's. And because somewhere in that animal's understanding of the world, showing weakness meant being pulled off the line, and being pulled off the line meant his handler walking through doors without him. Mason put his forehead down against the edge of the table. It was Serrano who asked the next question, and it was the question that turned the morning. She asked Frey about the angle. Frey went back to the screen. He worked it for a long time, longer than anyone in that room wanted him to, tracing the channel through tissue, the orientation of the fragment, the relationship between the entry and where the thing had come to rest. When he finally straightened up, he did not look at Mason. He looked at Serrano, and then he looked at the floor, and a man does not do that unless he is deciding whether to say something. He said it. He said the trajectory was consistent with a round, traveling from roughly 45 degrees off the dog's left rear from a position 20 to 30 meters behind his direction of travel. Behind. Mason said the word and did not recognize it. Frey said the most probable geometry was that the animal had been between the shooter and something behind him. Nobody moved. Pike, who had been leaning in the doorway with his arms folded for 10 minutes, dropped them and came fully into the room. Mason reconstructed the formation out loud because his mouth was working faster than the rest of him, and because saying it made it real in a way that thinking it did not. Atlas on point, himself directly behind the dog, 4 meters back. Pike and Whitlock left and right on the asset, and on rear left security 25 meters back holding the extraction route. Grant Voss. He said the name, and it landed in that room like something dropped from a height. Whitlock said no. He said it immediately and hard, the way a man rejects something before he has considered it, because considering it would mean the last 9 days of his life had been a different set of days than the ones he remembered. Mason was not listening to him. Mason was doing the geometry, and the geometry was doing something to his face that made Serrano take half a step toward him. He said that the round had been for him. He said that Atlas had been forward and left, where Atlas always drifted, where Mason had corrected him a dozen times over the years. Because doctrine said the dog should be centered on point, and Atlas kept sliding 2 feet off axis to the handler's weak side, and Mason had written it off as a training habit he had never fully sanded down. He said it slowly because he was hearing himself understand it as he spoke. The dog had not been drifting. The gang had been shielding. For 6 years, every single patrol, he had been standing in the line every time, and nobody had noticed because nothing had ever come down that line before. And 9 days ago, something had, and the dog had shifted 2 inches, and now there was a piece of metal 4 millimeters off his artery, and he was on a table with a needle 3 inches from his vein. Whitlock sat down, the door opened without a knock, and Captain Leland Marsh came in, and the temperature in that room dropped 10 degrees. Marsh was administration. Marsh had a clipboard in his hand and a schedule to keep, and he wanted to know why an authorized disposition had been open for 2 hours without execution, and he said the word disposition, and Mason came up off the floor. Pike got to him first, got an arm across his chest, and said his name twice low, the way you talk to a man who is 1 second from ending his own career. Serrano stepped between them and did something that saved everyone involved. She did not argue. She turned the monitor around. Marsh looked at it. He was not a cruel man, and he was not a stupid one, and the thing on that screen did not require a medical degree to understand. He asked what it was. Frey told him. Marsh asked how long. Frey told him that too, and watched the man's face while he did. Then Mason spoke, and his voice had gone flat and quiet, which was significantly worse than shouting. He asked the captain to pull up the field veterinary clearance attached to the authorization and read the signature block out loud. Marsh said he did not see the relevance. Mason said the corpsman who signed that clearance had been flown out on a medevac with a fractured pelvis the day before the exam allegedly happened. He said he could produce the flight manifest inside of an hour. He said that meant the document in that file was not late, and it was not sloppy, and it was not an administrative error, because a man in a hospital in Germany does not sign a wellness exam on a dog in California. The room went absolutely still. Serrano said very quietly that she had questioned the timing when it came down and had been told the endorsement was command level and not hers to interpret. Marsh asked who had told her that. She said it had come through his office. And Leland Marsh, 41 years old, 11 years behind a desk, went the color of paper because he understood in that instant that something had moved through his signature authority that he had not put there, and that if this dog had died on schedule, the only physical object in the world capable of proving it would have gone into an incinerator with him. He put the clipboard down on the counter. He asked Frey what the animal needed. Frey said an operating room, immediately. Marsh said, take it. He said he would clear it himself, and he would take whatever came afterward, and then he did something nobody expected, which was to look at Mason Reyes and say that he was sorry and mean it and get out of the way. Hey. Then Frey said the part he had been holding. I told Mason to hear him straight before anyone touched that dog. 4 millimeters off the pulmonary artery, 9 days of scar tissue that had welded the fragment into the surrounding structure, which meant it would not lift out clean, which meant traction, which meant risk. If it shifted a single millimeter in the wrong direction during extraction, the animal would bleed out internally in under 90 seconds, and there was not a surgeon alive who could stop it. He put the odds at 60% under ideal conditions. He said these were not ideal conditions. The dog was already in organ compromise. His pressure was unstable. He had spent 9 days burning through reserves that a healthy animal would need for exactly this. Mason asked what the alternative was. Frey said there was not one. He said the fragment had already migrated once, which was what caused the collapse, and that it would migrate again, and that when it did, it would open the artery, and the dog would die on a kennel floor in under 2 minutes with nobody holding him. So the choice was a table with a 60% chance or a floor with none. Mason looked down at his dog. Atlas had his eyes half open. He was tracking the voices the way he tracked everything, sorting the room by tone, the way he had done in every space he had ever entered. And his paw was still against Mason's wrist, still pressing, still saying the only sentence he had ever needed. Mason said to give him the chance. They moved him 9 minutes later. Mason walked beside the gurney with his hand buried in the fur behind the dog's ears. The whole way down the corridor, and Pike and Whitlock walked behind, and nobody spoke because there was nothing available to say. At the doors, Frey stopped and let him have 10 seconds. Mason bent down and put his forehead against the dog's, and he told him what he had told him in 3 countries, in 11 bad nights, in 1 collapsed building. That he did not quit. That was the rule. Atlas did not quit, and Mason did not quit. And that had been the arrangement since a storm and a kennel and a paw on a wrist 6 years ago. He said he would be standing right there when the doors opened. Atlas's tail moved once against the pad. Then they took him through, and the doors swung shut, and Mason Reyes stood in a corridor and understood that every part of him that mattered had just gone through them with a toy who could not hear him anymore. Whitlock got him to a chair. He did not sit in it. He stood beside it and paced, and the 3 of them occupied that waiting area. The way men trained for violent action always occupy a room where violent action is not an option, which is badly. 11 minutes and Pike was in the middle of saying something about Kandahar that was meant to fill silence and nothing else. He did not finish the sentence. Because the alarm started behind those doors, and they were not the polite chiming of a monitor asking for attention. They were the other kind, the kind that cuts through every other sound in a building and replaces it with a single flat certainty. 2 of them, then a third, then a voice raised into something urgent, then the fast slap of shoes on tile, and somebody calling for a crash cart by name. Whitlock was on his feet. Pike had gone completely white, and the surgical door came open, and Nadia Serrano came through it with her mask pulled down under her chin, and she found Mason's eyes across that corridor, and she said 4 words. His heart just stopped. Mason came up out of a half-sleep with his hand still around the paw, and the sound going straight through his spine before his brain had assembled what it was. It was low. It was continuous. It was coming from a buck who had been unconscious for 11 hours and had no business producing any sound at all. And Mason had heard that exact register out of that exact animal 3 times in 6 years, and every single time it had preceded something bad by about 4 seconds. He said the dog's name. Atlas did not respond. Atlas was not listening to him. The head was up off the mat, ears forward, eyes locked on the doorway, and past it down the corridor at something Mason could not hear and could not see, and the growl did not stop or waver or break. Then the dog tried to stand. Mason got both hands on him and told him no. Serrano was already coming through the door because the monitor at her station had started climbing, and she had assumed it was cardiac. She took one look and said absolutely not, that the sutures would not hold that. He was 9 hours off a table and 6 minutes off a cardiac arrest, and she got a hand on the harness strap. Atlas came up anyway. He came up on legs that had nothing left in them, dragged the IV stand 2 feet across the tile with the line still in his foreleg, and put his shoulder into the door frame to keep himself upright. Serrano actually stepped back, not out of fear, out of something closer to disbelief, because a body in that condition does not do that, and she had spent 20 years learning what bodies do. Mason stopped fighting him. That was the decision he came back to later over and over, the one he could not fully explain. He let go of the harness and he said one word, and the word was okay, and then he moved with the dog instead of against him. Atlas went down the corridor at a lurching 3-legged walk that cost him something visible with every step, and he did not go toward the exit, and he did not go toward the kennels. He went left, past recovery, past supply, and he stopped in front of the door at the end that had a keypad on it and a chain of custody log taped to the wall beside it, and he planted himself there, and the growl went up an octave. Mason heard the latch disengage from the inside. Whitlock had come awake in the waiting area and was already halfway down the hall. Pike was 3 steps behind him, and the door opened and a man came out with a small evidence container in his hand, and he got exactly 1 step into that corridor before he stopped, because there was 70 pounds of German Shepherd standing between him and the rest of the building, with his lips pulled back and his weight forward and an IV line still taped to his leg. It was Ray Tobin, Chief Warrant Officer, 19 years in, the mission planner who had built the extraction route, who had sat in the back of every brief with a coffee and a laptop, who had helped carry a cooler to Whitlock's daughter's birthday party in March. He had a badge in his hand that had opened a door. He had no reason to open at 2 in the morning, and he had the container in the other, and he was frozen because the animal in front of him had not barked and had not lunged, and was simply standing there, refusing to let him pass, the way that dog had refused to be moved off a pile of concrete for 9 hours with his pads split open. Whitlock said his name, just the name, and there was so much in it that Tobin flinched. Tobin started to explain. He got about 4 words out, something about a chain of custody transfer, something about an early courier. And Pike said flatly that it was 2 in the morning and there was no courier. And Tobin looked at the container in his own hand and understood that whatever he said next would be a matter of record. Atlas took 1 step forward. That was all, 1 step. And Ray Tobin, 19 years in uniform, put the container on the floor and raised his hands. Kobayashi had him inside of 11 minutes. It took her people 6 hours to work out what he had been doing there, and when she came back that afternoon, she laid it out with the flat exhaustion of a woman who had gotten no sleep and had stopped being surprised by anything years ago. Tobin was the second signature. The workflow Voss had used to push the falsified authorization required an authenticating officer, someone with planning access who could validate that the field veterinary exam had occurred in theater. Voss had the credentials. Tobin had the authority to say it was real. He had not been paid. That was the part Kobayashi said twice, because it was the part that made everyone in that room feel sick in a different way than they had felt sick before. Tobin had not taken $1. Voss had gone to him 6 days earlier and told him that the dog was declining, that the animal was suffering, that Reyes was too attached to make the call, and that the humane thing was to move it through quietly and spare the handler the process of arguing with a form. And Ray Tobin had believed him and signed it and gone home and slept. Then the dog had collapsed, and the collapse had put an X-ray machine against those ribs, and by noon the entire base knew there was a fragment. And Tobin had spent that whole day working out what he had actually authenticated and had arrived at the only conclusion available, and had panicked and had gone down to that evidence room at 2 in the morning to make one bad decision, disappear, and had instead walked directly into the one witness who could not be reasoned with. Kobayashi said he had folded inside of 20 minutes and had given her everything, including a conversation with Voss from 11 days back that put the whole thing beyond argument. Voss himself broke that same afternoon. Not dramatically. She said that was the thing people always expected and never got. He had held a version for 40 minutes on the first interview and had held nothing at all on the second, and when it went the way a man collapses when the debts have finally outgrown the story he has been telling himself about who he is. He had a second mortgage he could not service. He had a gambling account he had never told his wife about. He had told himself for 11 weeks that selling a root was not the same as selling a person. He had not made the shot to kill Mason Reyes because he hated him. Kobayashi said that flat, had made it because a broker had required proof of completion and because at that exact moment in that exact quarter, Grant Voss had been more afraid of the man he owed money to than of the man he had sworn an oath beside. Mason listened to all of it sitting on the floor with his back against the recovery mat and did not say one word until she finished. Then he asked what the charges were. She read them: espionage, conspiracy, attempted murder of a service member, evidence tampering, and then she said the last one, which was destruction of military property, and explained that because Atlas was classified as a military working dog, the shooting constituted a federal offense on its own. Mason said no. Kobayashi stopped. He said the dog was not military property. He said he understood the statute, he understood the language, he understood that she had not written it. But he said that if this went into a courtroom and the record described what happened to Atlas as damage to a piece of equipment, then Voss would have won something and Mason was not willing to give him that. Kobayashi wrote it down. She said she could not change the statute. Commander Ruth Okafor could. She came to the clinic herself the next morning, which nobody expected, and she stood in that recovery room for a long moment before she said anything at all. Then she told Mason that she had spoken to the prosecutor and that the charging documents would name Atlas as a victim of the assault rather than an item of damaged property, that it would create procedural work for everyone involved, and that she did not care. Then she asked how he was doing, and Mason lied, and she let him. The dog came back slowly and then all at once. He came off full support on day 2. He drank on his own on day 2.5. On the morning of day 3, he lifted his head when a tech dropped a clipboard down the hall and put both ears forward, and Serrano stood in the doorway and cried silently for about 15 seconds and then went back to work and pretended it had not happened. Frey examined him on the third morning and could not account for it. He said the organ values were reversing faster than any projection he would have committed to on paper. He said the surgical site was clean and the pain responses were appropriate and the cardiac function had come back to baseline. He said he had no clinical explanation, and then he said he had a personal one and that Mason would have to buy him a drink before he heard it. Mason said he would buy him 10. Marsh came by that afternoon. He did not bring a clipboard. He stood in the doorway and said that he had been going through his own office for 2 days and that he had found 4 other documents that had moved through the same subordinate workflow in the last 18 months, all of them minor, none of them criminal, all of them proof that the hole had been there the entire time and that he had never once looked for it. He said that he had almost had a dog killed to cover a murder and that he had done it in under 90 seconds without reading past the second line. Mason told him that the 14-hour timestamp was the only reason any of them knew anything, and that Marsh was the one who had turned the screen around when Serrano showed him, and that a different man in that job would have executed the order and gone to lunch. Marsh said that was not much. Mason said it was the whole case. 3 days after the surgery, they walked out. Not carried, not wheeled. Serrano had argued for a crate, and Frey had overruled her, and Atlas came through that lobby on his own. Forepaws slow leaning his shoulder into Mason's leg, every 4th or 5th step, stopping twice to gather himself bandaged tight along the left side. Mason kept his hand on the dog's back the entire way and was not guiding him. He was just there. They got through the front entrance and Atlas stopped and Mason looked up to see why. The walkway was lined on both sides. Nobody had told him. Whitlock had put out one message and it had gone through the unit, the way those things go. And there were men out there who had driven in from 40 minutes away on a Tuesday morning to stand in 2 rows in uniform for a dog. Men from every team, operators who had been cleared by Atlas through doorways they were not sure about. A master chief who had been 3 feet from a charge atlas found in a culvert in 2010, and who had a daughter who was 11 now because of it. Nobody spoke. Then Pike started clapping. One pair of hands slow, deliberate, the kind of applause that has weight in it rather than noise. Whitlock joined him, then the man behind him, and then the next, and it built the way a wave builds, low and controlled and enormous. And it was not the sound of a stadium. It was the sound of men who do not have any other approved method of saying what they were saying. Atlas stopped walking and put both ears up and turned his head toward it. And his tail started to move, not the weak fraction of the recovery room, a real one, full and steady and unmistakable, the tail of a dog who has just found his people and is glad about it. Mason went down on one knee beside him and could not get his throat to work. He got out 3 words. He said, "They came for you," and Atlas turned and put his tongue against the side of Mason's face once hard, the way he had done 10,000 times, and it meant what it had always meant. Okafor was at the end of the walkway in dress uniform, which Mason had seen her wear exactly twice. She crouched down in front of the dog, and Atlas regarded her with that calm, level attention. He gave every officer respect without submission, and she read the commendation out loud in a voice that stayed flat, because 30 years of command teaches a person how to keep it flat when everything under it is not. She read the part about sustaining a ballistic wound while shielding his handler. She read the part about continuing to perform mission-critical duties despite severe internal injury. She read the part about extraordinary loyalty and courage beyond the expectation of training or duty. And when she got to the end, she folded the paper and looked at Mason and told him that she had signed commendations for men who had done less than this dog had done and had not had to bleed for 9 days without complaining about it. Then Ruth Okafor put her hand on Atlas's head and said the only 2 words that animal had ever actually cared about in his entire life. "Good boy." The tail hit the pavement once, and every man on that walkway who had spent his adult life learning how to keep his face still lost the argument at the same time I shone. The hearing convened 11 weeks later, and Mason Rekas walked into that room with his dog beside him because Ruth Okafor had made 2 phone calls to ensure that he could. The defense had filed to exclude the animal from the proceeding. The motion argued that the presence of the dog was prejudicial, that it served no evidentiary function, that it was theater. Okafor's response had been 3 lines long and had pointed out that the animal in question was named in the charging documents as a victim of the assault and that victims were permitted to attend. The motion was denied. Mason had read the ruling 4 times before he believed it. Atlas lay under the table with his chin on Mason's boot and did not move for 2 hours. The defense strategy became clear inside the first 20 minutes, and it was uglier than anything Mason had prepared himself for. Counsel did not contest the shooting. They could not. What they contested was what the shooting had been. They argued that in the confusion of a night engagement with 3 hostile positions, active in rounds coming from multiple axes, a rear security element firing into his own formation was a tragedy and a failure of discipline, and not an act of intent. They argued that the sale of the extraction route was a separate offense, entirely serious, prosecutable, and unrelated. 2 crimes, they said, not one. And for about 40 minutes it worked. Mason sat there and listened to a lawyer construct a version of the world where Grant Voss was a desperate man who had made a catastrophic mistake in the dark, and he felt the room bending toward it because juries and panels want that version. It is easier to live in. Then Malcolm Frey took the stand. Frey did not perform. That was what made it land. He answered every question in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had spent 30 years telling families things they did not want to hear, and he did not editorialize once. He described the fragment. He described the entry channel. He described the angle 45 degrees off the left rear. And when defense counsel suggested that a ricochet could produce such an angle, Frey agreed that it could, and then explained without being asked twice that a ricochet loses velocity and deforms, and that this fragment had entered with a velocity and orientation consistent with direct fire at a range under 30 meters. Then he was asked about the scar tissue, and that was the moment the room changed. Frey said 9 days minimum. He described the layering. He described what 9 days of that meant in an animal that size in terms of continuous mechanical irritation against an artery, and he was asked whether the dog would have been in pain. Frey said yes. He was asked how much. And Frey said that in a human patient with an identical injury, he would have expected the individual to be non-ambulatory and on continuous narcotic management within 72 hours. He said the dog had completed 2 full training cycles. Nobody in that room said anything for several seconds, and defense counsel sat down without asking a second question. Then Kobayashi put the paper trail on the record, and the two crimes theory came apart in 11 minutes. Because a man who is fired by accident does not 9 days later obtain another officer's credentials. He does not fabricate a field veterinary exam. He does not sign the name of a corpsman lying in a hospital bed in Germany with a fractured pelvis. He does not construct a false record of behavioral degradation in an animal with a 6-year service history containing 0 aggression incidents. And he does not push a destruction order through a subordinate workflow disguised as a command endorsement 11 hours and 33 minutes before that animal shows a single symptom of anything. Kobayashi laid the timestamp on the screen and left it there, and the panel president asked her to repeat the interval, and she repeated it. 11 hours and 33 minutes before the collapse. That was the entire case. Everything after it was procedure. Because there was only one reason on earth to schedule the death of a healthy dog, and it was sitting in a sealed container on the evidence table, a piece of metal the size of a fingernail that had spent 9 days inside the only witness who could not be bought, could not be discredited, and could not be talked out of what he knew. Mason testified after the recess. He had rehearsed nothing. Okafor had told him not to. He was asked to describe the extraction, and he did in the flat, compressed language men use for those things. And he got through the ambush and the corridors and the extraction point without difficulty because he had told that story before. Then he was asked about the field check afterward, and something in him gave. He said he had run his hands over the entire animal. He said he had done it the way he had done it after every engagement for 6 years, nose to tail, checking pads, checking the gums, checking under the harness. He said there was no blood. He said the dog had leaned into his legs and licked his face and behaved exactly like a dog behaves when the bad part is over. He was asked if he had any indication at all that Atlas was injured. And Mason Reyes said on the record that he had heard a sound during the engagement that did not match the incoming fire, and that he had made a judgment call in the middle of a firefight, and that he had been wrong, and that his dog had paid for it for 9 days without ever once telling him. Under the table, Atlas lifted his head and put his chin on Mason's knee. The panel president called a 5-minute recess and did not give a reason. Voss was brought in for the afternoon session, and that was when it happened. He had been in the room all morning. Atlas had not reacted to him once, not when he entered, not when he sat, not when his name was spoken 40 times across 2 hours of testimony. The dog had spent the entire proceeding asleep on a boot. But when the session resumed after the recess, and Voss came back through the door and passed within 20 feet of the table, Atlas stood up. Mason felt him go and got a hand on the harness, and there was no need for it. The dog was not lunging. He was not barking. He had risen stiffly with the deliberate care of an animal who still had a healing wound under his ribs, and he had turned and squared himself, and he was simply looking at Grant Voss from 20 feet away, with both ears forward in absolute stillness in every part of him. He did not growl. That was the thing every person in that room reported afterward, and none of them could explain why it was so much worse. He just watched him. Voss made it about 9 seconds. He tried to sit down and could not get his hands to work on the chair, and his counsel had to reach over and steady it, and he ended up sitting with his head down and his shoulders pulled in like a man in a wind, and he did not look up again for the remainder of the session. He changed his plea before the day ended. Kobayashi told Mason afterward in the hallway that in 15 years she had watched confessions come out of people under every kind of pressure the law permits, and a few it does not. She said she had never seen one produced by an animal standing in a room refusing to look away. Ray Tobin pleaded separately and cooperated fully and received a sentence that Mason thought was too light for about a month, and then stopped thinking about it all because Tobin had come to the clinic before the hearing and asked to see the dog, and Serrano had let him stand in the doorway for 30 seconds without going in. He had not made excuses. He had said one sentence. He said he had signed something he had not read about an animal he had known for 4 years and that he would carry it. Mason believed him. He did not forgive him. Those were two different things, and he had made his peace with holding both. The broker network came apart across the following 6 months. 9 arrests in 3 jurisdictions. Two compromise operations that had never been identified as compromised, reconstructed, and closed. Kobayashi's office traced Voss's intelligence leak backward and found that it had touched for 4 missions before the one on the coast, and that men had come home from those missions not knowing how close they had come. All of it started with a fragment the size of a fingernail that existed nowhere in the world except inside a German shepherd who had refused to limp. But the thing that lasted, the thing that outlived the trial and the sentencing and the news cycle that never quite happened, was the paperwork. Leland Marsh wrote it himself, 11 pages drafted over 3 weekends, and he walked it up the chain personally rather than sending it, which was not how anything in that building was normally done. It required mandatory independent diagnostic imaging for every military working dog within 72 hours of any live engagement, regardless of whether the handler's field check found anything, and specifically noting that a negative field check was not sufficient grounds for waiver. It required 2 separate veterinary signatures from 2 separate practitioners for any disposition authorization with a mandatory 48-hour hold. It required direct notification of the handler of record before any such document could be executed, with the handler's acknowledgement logged as a discrete step that could not be bypassed by administrative endorsement. And it closed the subordinate workflow that Grant Voss had walked through permanently. It went into effect at Naval Special Warfare Command 14 months later and was adopted across the working dog program the following year. It has a formal designation that nobody uses. Everybody in that unit calls it by the dog's name. Frey's personal theory came out over that drink, eventually in a bar in Coronado on a Thursday, and it was not medical at all. He said he had operated on a lot of bodies that had every reason to keep going and had stopped anyway. He said he had come to believe that survival at the far edge is not a physical question, that at a certain point the body has said everything it can say and something else has to answer, and that whatever answers is not the same in every patient. He said that in 30 years he had seen it answer for spouses, for children, for unfinished things. He said he had never seen it answer as fast or as hard as it had answered in that dog, and that he had spent 11 weeks trying to talk himself out of the conclusion and had failed. He said the animal had not been fighting to live. He said the animal had been fighting to get back to a man in a hallway who had asked him not to quit. Mason bought him the 10 drinks. Frey took 2. The medical retirement came through on a Tuesday. Effective immediately, full transfer of ownership, no conditions. Mason signed the papers at his kitchen table while Atlas worked on a chew toy that Pike had delivered the week before with a card taped to it. The card read 4 legs, no quit, and it was signed by every man who had stood on that walkway. He kept the card. He still has it. The recovery took 9 months. There were setbacks. There was a stretch in February where the surgical site flared, and Serrano put the dog back on antibiotics for 11 days, and Mason did not sleep well for any of them. There was permanent reduction in stamina, a slight favoring of the left side that came out on cold mornings, and a scar under the coat that he could find with 2 fingers in the dark, which he did more often than he ever admitted to anyone. Atlas did not care about any of it. He learned the neighborhood. He learned which houses had children and which had cats, and he developed strong opinions about both. He slept on the floor beside the bed for the first 3 weeks, and then without permission and without discussion on the bed, and Mason never once corrected it. Whitlock came by most Sundays. Pike came less often because Pike got transferred, but he called. On a Thursday in the fall on the porch with the light going and the salt coming in off the water, Mason sat with his dog's head on his knee, which was the same position from a training kennel 6 years earlier when a wild 2-year-old had refused to look at a human being for 11 days, and then on the 12th night in a storm had put a paw on a young sailor's wrist and changed the entire arc of both their lives. He talked to him the way he always had, low, steady, nothing important. He said that he had spent 11 weeks in a courtroom listening to lawyers argue about intent and trajectory and statutes, and that not one of them had ever asked the only question that mattered. He said that everybody kept talking about the 2 inches. 2 inches of lateral drift. That was the whole thing. That was the difference between a man sitting on a porch in the fall and a man in a box with a flag on it. Frey had reconstructed it, the panel had heard it, Kobayashi had put it in a report, and every one of them had treated it as a fact of geometry. Mason said it was not geometry. When he said that Atlas had drifted left for 6 years, every patrol, Every corridor, every doorway. He said he had corrected it a dozen times because doctrine said the dog belonged centered on point, and the dog had said nothing and gone right back to it the next day, and Mason had assumed it was a habit he had failed to train out. He said it had never once been a habit. He said his dog had decided somewhere in the first year without being asked, and without being trained, and without anyone ever noticing that the space between Mason Reyes and whatever was coming belonged to him, and he had held that space for 6 years for nothing until the one night something finally came down it. And then he had held it anyway. And then he had gotten up the next morning with a piece of metal against his artery and gone back to work, because stopping would have meant Mason going through a door without him, and there was no version of that animal that permitted it. Mason said that people had told him for 11 weeks that the dog had saved his life. He said they were being generous with the tents. He said Atlas had not saved his life on the coast. He had saved it every single day for 6 years, and the coast was just the one time anybody happened to be watching. Atlas opened his eyes and looked up at him, and it was the same look it had always been, from the kennel and the buildings and the helicopters and the exam table with the needle 3 inches from his vein. Not asking for anything. Never once in 6 years asking for anything. Mason put his hand flat on the dog's chest over the heart that had stopped for 6 minutes and started again, and he said the only thing left to say. He said, "Thank you." The tail moved once against the boards. Once was enough. It had always been enough. Somewhere on the other side of the country, a man who had sold a route for $80,000 was serving out a sentence with the knowledge that everything he built came apart because of a dog he had shot in the dark and could not kill. He had planned around men, around procedures, around paperwork, around every system he understood. He had never accounted for the one thing that could not be bought, could not be intimidated, could not be reasoned with, and would not let go. That is the whole story, and it has one lesson in it, and it is this: the ones who love you most rarely announce it. They do not tell you what they are carrying. They stand where the danger is. Without being asked, they hide the cost so you will not send them home, and they keep showing up beside you long after their bodies have stopped being able to afford it. Do not wait for a table and a needle in a doctor's hand to find out what somebody has been carrying for you. Some heroes never speak a single word in their lives, and they say more than the rest of us ever will.